The third and final of Germany's Panzerschiffe, the Graf Spee is arguably the most famous of the bunch. More formally known as Admiral Graf Spee, though the Admiral is often left out, this ship had a short but exciting career. Perhaps not surprising, considering she is named for Maximilian von Spee, a man who had a short but exciting wartime career a couple decades before. It's fitting, though a tad ironic. The comparisons don't end there either, considering that Graf Spee would end up fighting her famous engagement not that far, in absolute terms, from where her namesake went down, and she fought against the same enemy at that. That said, the ship is probably more famous than the Admiral in the modern day. Having a movie made about her probably helped there. In any case, let's get into the meat of the video now. Laid down on October 1st, 1932, and launched on June 30th, 1934, Graf Spee would be commissioned into the German fleet on January 6th of 1936. In this, she became one of the first ships commissioned into the Kriegsmarine, though she had been laid down and launched as part of the preceding Reichsmarine. The change in name for the German fleet came in 1935, which led to Spee being different to her sisters in this regard, as well as others. For instance, there was enough time between the construction of each Panzerschiffe to lead to various differences in design. In the case of Graf Spee, she was a bit heavier at up to 16,000 or so tons when fully loaded. This, of course, breaks the ostensible 10,000 ton displacement by quite a bit. Kind of like the Hippers in this regard. On that hull, she carried 6 28cm, 11-inch guns and 2 triple turrets, one mounted fore and one aft. These guns allowed her to outgun any cruiser, though they were on the smaller side for a proper capital ship. For the role that Graf Spee ended up performing, of a commerce raider, her secondary battery was arguably better anyway. Carrying 8 15cm, 5.9-inch guns in single mounts, these allowed the ship to pound any transport into the bottom without wasting her main battery ammunition. Even light cruisers could be engaged by these guns, though with the caveat that she only had 4 of them on either side of the ship. Her 8 21-inch torpedo tubes, mounted on the stern and 2 quadruple launchers, rounded out her offensive firepower. Defensive firepower, more specifically her anti-aircraft battery, was initially fairly light, with only 3 Great War vintage 88mm guns, as designed. By the time she was actually launched, this was replaced by 6 newer 88mm weapons. Come 1938, those were replaced, in turn, by 6 105mm guns, 4 37mm guns, and 10 20mm cannon. While we're on the subject of defense, her armor belt was 100mm, 3.9 inches thick, with a 17mm thick deck. Finishing off her notable equipment, Graf Spee carried a single catapult for her single floatplane, as well as a radar set, making her the first German warship to receive such technology. All of this was fitted on a hull that could manage 28 knots on average, though she managed nearly 30 knots on her sea trials. Mind you, all of that technology and equipment saw a fairly quiet early career. While Graf Spee quickly became the German flagship, the most excitement she saw was patrols off the Spanish coast. These neutrality patrols during the Spanish Civil War were a fairly common feature at the time, seeing ships from European powers and the United States alike. While they would occasionally end up attacked by Spanish forces on either side of the Civil War, the patrols were more often uneventful. Interesting, considering the mixing of nationalities and navies, but uneventful nonetheless. Graf Spee would perform 3 such patrols in her early career before she made a detour to Britain in May of 1937. This was for the coronation review of King George VI on May 20th. The review presented some interesting pictures in hindsight. While British and German relations were nowhere near as frosty as they would get later in the decade, it's still a bit surreal looking at a picture of Graf Spee and Hood floating next to each other without a care in the world. In any case, though, this was only a short break in her career. After the British detour was over, Graf Spee returned to Spanish waters for her 4th neutrality patrol. Then it was back home for fleet maneuvers and a visit to Sweden before she returned to Spain for a 5th patrol in February of 1938. As it would turn out, that was her last neutrality patrol. The remainder of her peacetime career would be, instead of further Spanish patrols, spent on goodwill visits and fleet maneuvers. Now under the command of Hans Langsdorff, Graf Spee reverted to typical peacetime duties. Nothing major or notable other than a German fleet review and in May of 1939, a stopover in Spain and Portugal. That would be her last time visiting foreign ports at peace. For in August of 1939, Graf Spee was sent to the South Atlantic as war clouds grew ever heavier in Europe. She would never return home. In light of Germany's position, this decision to send the cruiser out early was a reasonable one. While Britain didn't have the Grand Fleet to blockade German harbors anymore, getting raiders out into the Atlantic was still a difficult task. The British could, and would, hunt any attempt to sortie from German ports. Ask Bismarck how well that went. Moreover, Germany didn't have the advantage of far-flung colonial bases to pull cruisers off of like they had in the Great War. By having Graf Spee already at sea when war broke out, it was far easier to immediately start hunting enemy shipping than it otherwise would have been. And that was what Langsdorff was ordered to do with his ship: take her out and hunt British and French shipping. However, in a show of surprising restraint, he was ordered to adhere to prize rules. Ships would be warned before Graf Spee took them under fire, and as much as possible, she was to stop and search a ship before going so far as to sink her. Furthermore, the crews of said ships were to be treated with all due respect and allowed to safely evacuate before their ships were taken or sunk, given plenty of time to get to the lifeboats and await rescue. Compared to the U-boat campaign, this is remarkably lenient of the Germans. As for direct combat with enemy warships, Langsdorff was ordered to avoid that entirely, if at all possible. While Graf Spee was theoretically superior to any cruiser she could come across, and certainly more than able to deal with armed merchant ships, this was considered too great a risk. The German fleet didn't have many ships to begin with, and even fewer capable of long-distance raiding. Couple that with a distinct lack of friendly ports to make repairs or resupply, and engaging the enemy wasn't worth the effort. The ship could be damaged, the ship could fire off too much ammo to sink an enemy warship, and in general it would detract from the actual merchant raiding, which was considered far more valuable of a task. In simpler terms, why bother engaging warships when you could be beating up on defenseless merchant ships? With these orders in hand, Langsdorff set sail. On the day the war began, September 1st, 1939, Graf Spee took on supplies from the supply ship Altmark. Following this, and evading HMS Cumberland on September 11th, the cruiser started her hunting spree. First came the SS Clement on September 30th, a 5,000-ton freighter that Graf Spee overhauled off the coast of Brazil before stopping and inspecting in accordance with the previously mentioned prize rules. Langsdorff took her captain and engineer aboard his own ship before sinking Clement with gunfire and 2 torpedoes. The German captain then proceeded to send a distress call on behalf of the stranded crew. That is an old kind of honor at sea, too often forgotten. Though it did mean that the British and French were fully aware that there was a German raider hunting their shipping. And because there's no kill quite like overkill, the response was to form no fewer than 8 task groups to hunt Graf Spee down on October 5th. This saw 4 aircraft carriers committed to the hunt, 3 British carriers, Hermes, Eagle, and Ark Royal, as well as the sole French aircraft carrier, Béarn. In addition, the bow cruiser Renown and the battleships Dunkirk and Strasbourg, specifically designed to counter the Panzerschiffe, were also committed. Perhaps the most striking thing is that no fewer than 16 cruisers were assigned to help hunt Graf Spee. While certainly overkill, the sheer amount of resources does make some level of sense when one considers the amount of area that needed searching. The South Atlantic is massive, and it is quite easy to hide there in the days before satellites. And for a fair bit of time, Graf Spee would do just that, evading all attempts to catch her. The same couldn't be said of merchant shipping trying to avoid being captured by the German raider. First, on the same day as those task forces were formed, Graf Spee caught the steamer Newton Beach. This ship she initially kept around to serve as a prisoner transport. Then, on October 7th, she caught another prize, the Ashley. This ship was sunk outright, though Newton Beach would not outlive her for long. Realizing the merchant was too slow to keep up, and unwilling to risk his own ship to keep her around, Langsdorff transferred the prisoners to Graf Spee and sank Newton Beach on October 8th. After a fruitless day of hunting on October 9th, the Germans would come across another steamer on the 10th. That was the Huntsman, which was captured after mistaking Graf Spee for a French warship. Oops. Langsdorff decided against sinking her, at least at first, as he was running out of space for prisoners. Instead, he sent Huntsman off to rendezvous with Altmark. By the 17th of October, the three ships had all joined up with each other. Prisoners were taken off both Graf Spee and Huntsman to be put aboard Altmark, at which point the cruiser sank Huntsman as well. Langsdorff's tally was now at 4 ships, soon joined by a 5th, the Trevanian, on October 22nd. However, with the South Atlantic becoming a riskier hunting ground, the Germans diverted instead to the Indian Ocean. This was by no means a small trip, especially as Graf Spee had already steamed some 30,000 nautical miles without anything resembling a refit. While her diesel engines were intended for long-distance sailing, this was still quite a lot of time at sea. As one could expect, Graf Spee was beginning to have issues maintaining her full speed, though she had yet to need it. She would need a refit and overhaul if she wanted to be in top condition, though. I'm sure that won't end up becoming an issue at all. In any case, now in the Indian Ocean, the German raider would spend the first half of November sailing around Madagascar. In so doing, she would sink a tanker, Africa Shell, on November 15th. Soon after, a Dutch steamer would be fortunate in that while spotted by the cruiser, she wasn't sunk. With his tally now totaling 6 ships, Langsdorff returned to the South Atlantic for another meeting with Altmark. This saw Graf Spee refueled and resupplied, while the crew busied themselves constructing a dummy funnel behind the aircraft catapult and a fake turret around her bridge. This was never intended to be a perfect disguise, but it was hoped that it would make her look like an Allied cruiser at a distance. It's also somewhat interesting, for different reasons, that I'll get into at the end of the video. That aside, now with a disguise in place, Graf Spee broke off from Altmark and returned to her hunting grounds in the South Atlantic. Her Arado scouts spotted the steamer Doric Star on December 2nd, which led to a chase that saw the British freighter managing to get off a distress signal before Langsdorff overtook her. This would end up being something of an issue, though it didn't immediately put an end to Graf Spee's raiding. The next day, she sank the steamer Tyroa, and on December 7th, she sank the freighter Strenshala, which I'm sure I butchered. As it would turn out, though, that would end up being her last victim. With most of the prisoners transferred to Altmark once again, Graf Spee set off for the South American coast. Langsdorff had picked up secret documents from his prizes, and thanks to maps of shipping routes, thought he had a perfect area to hunt in. Alas, he miscalculated here. First, the Arado scout had broken down, which meant Graf Spee was limited to relatively short spotting distances. This prompted the removal of the disguise, as it would interfere in combat operations if that became necessary. Second, that message from Doric Star had prompted the British Force G, under Commodore Henry Harwood, to set up a patrol in exactly the area that Graf Spee was steaming towards. Harwood was convinced the raider would sail towards the River Plate, and as it turned out, he was correct. The combination of these factors meant that, on the morning of December 13th, 1939, Graf Spee's lookout spotted masts on the horizon. Langsdorff, at first, assumed these to be escorts for a convoy, or perhaps the convoy itself. He was very wrong. Within 30 minutes of the initial sighting, at 5:52 a.m., the lookouts identified the upcoming masts as warships, specifically the heavy cruiser HMS Exeter and 2 other ships. Initially misidentified as destroyers, these were actually the Leander-class light cruisers Ajax and Achilles. Individually, or together, these ships were theoretically outmatched by Graf Spee. The German ship had heavier armor, had the range advantage with her 11-inch rifles, and could dictate the engagement in most circumstances. Now, it's worth remembering that Langsdorff had specific orders to not engage enemy warships of any kind. If he followed his orders to the letter, he would have attempted to pull away and not fight the British. Instead, he put Graf Spee to the full speed she could manage and charged right in. The following battle is really deserving of its own video, but I'll cover it in summary here. The first thing to keep in mind here is that Langsdorff did not make an inherent mistake in charging in as he did. While he outranged the British cruisers with Graf Spee's main battery, the German raider was in bad need of an overhaul. She couldn't outpace the British, even if she were at her best, and certainly not after months and tens of thousands of miles of sailing. An advantage in gunnery range doesn't matter if your enemy can sail out of your range and wait for reinforcements. In closing the range, Langsdorff forced the British to fight. This did, however, place someone into Harwood's hands. The British officer had planned for something like this and promptly split his formation. Exeter sailed northwest, while Ajax and Achilles stuck together to the northeast. This would both bracket the German raider and force her to split her fire. Or so the plan went, though instead of splitting fire completely, Graf Spee simply used her main battery on Exeter and her secondary battery on the light cruisers. Showing a surprisingly good level of accuracy, the Germans were straddling Exeter by the third salvo, close enough that fragments from a near miss were able to kill the British cruiser's torpedo tube crew. This was bad enough, even if the torpedoes would not play a part in the battle, but it also riddled her communications equipment, funnels, and searchlights, as well as wrecking Exeter's own scout aircraft as it was about to launch to provide spotting assistance. Continuing to show her accuracy, not even 5 minutes later, Graf Spee landed a direct hit on Exeter's B turret. This was promptly put out of action, while shrapnel cut down most of her bridge personnel. Her captain, fortunately, escaped injury alongside 2 other men. Though he escaped injury, he was cut off from direct command of his ship. Exeter's communication systems were further wrecked to the point the cruiser had to be steered by a chain of messengers running back and forth across the ship. Things would hardly get better for her as Graf Spee, in spite of splitting her fire, continued to pound Exeter. The British cruiser would get off 2 torpedoes from her starboard tubes, both of which missed, before making a turn to try her luck with her port tubes. In so doing, she took 2 more direct hits from the Germans' main battery. This time, the 11-inch shells hit both A turret, knocking out Exeter's second bow turret, and her hull. The hull hit started some pretty bad fires aboard the cruiser, while the turret hit left Exeter down to only her stern turret, operating on local control. Not a good situation to be in when she started the battle outgunned by Graf Spee. It did produce the amusing image, in hindsight, of her wide turret commander standing atop the roof to shout instructions to his gun crew. While Exeter was being shot to ribbons, Ajax and Achilles closed to about 13,000 yards and turned ahead of Graf Spee, forcing her to divide her fire properly. While this did take some of the pressure off of Exeter, it was not quite enough. The heavy cruiser had a 7-degree list and was being steered by a compass taken from one of her boats. One could be forgiven for thinking she was out of the fight at this point. However, she managed to get one critically important hit in with her final turret. One of her shells punched through Graf Spee and destroyed her fuel processing system. This left her with nowhere near enough fuel to return home. She had about 16 hours of fuel left, which is definitely not get all the way across the Atlantic amounts of fuel. Damage of this kind is exactly why the raiders were forbidden from engaging the enemy, even in a fight they could theoretically win. Graf Spee was doomed now, because even if she somehow succeeded in winning the battle, she wouldn't be able to make repairs before other ships showed up. Her crew certainly couldn't do it in the middle of battle. While the German cruiser's armor belt was intact, the damage was starting to add up. There was the fuel system damage, 2/3 of her anti-aircraft battery was out of action, and one of her secondary guns was similarly taken out. She wasn't at risk of sinking, but the situation was by no means a good one. As such, Langsdorff made the, tactically sound, decision to make for the neutral port of Montevideo. To do so, Graf Spee had to sail past the listing Exeter, still firing with her stern turret, while under fire from Ajax and Achilles as well. Another shell from Graf Spee's main battery would, eventually, land close enough to splash water aboard and short-circuit the electrical systems on Exeter's wide turret. This put the stubborn heavy cruiser out of the fight, though her light cruiser comrades kept Langsdorff from trying to finish her off. Not that he didn't try anyway, but Exeter would end up escaping to fight another day. As for Graf Spee, continuing to be peppered by 6-inch shells, she turned back for Montevideo. After driving the British cruisers off, including disabling 2 turrets aboard Ajax, she continued on her way. Ajax and Achilles continued to pursue, but the British had decided to back off and shadow Graf Spee instead. So it was that after midnight on December 14th, the Germans entered Montevideo's harbor. Graf Spee would never leave. The damage to her fuel systems, in addition to her desalination plant and a hole in her bow, would take up to 2 weeks to repair. That hole, in particular, could be a real issue if she encountered rough seas on a long voyage home. Moreover, Graf Spee had shot off most of her ammunition. If she ran into combat, that would be an even larger issue. With the British applying pressure to enforce neutrality rules, Graf Spee was given only 72 hours in port, nowhere near enough time to make repairs, and ignoring, again, that she was in no shape to fight even if her damage was patched up. Langsdorff had to weigh this in any plans to escape. While the British were doing everything in their power, up to and including feeding false intelligence to the Germans, to convince him that far more ships were waiting outside Montevideo than it appeared. Up to and including Force H, featuring Ark Royal and Renown. This would have been more than enough to handle Graf Spee, even if she were in perfect fighting order with a full load of ammunition. Langsdorff believed these reports. Even if he hadn't, the arrival of HMS Cumberland to replace Exeter was still probably enough to keep the Germans from escaping. So the captain discussed his options with Berlin, which basically amounted to scuttle the ship or try to make a run for Argentina. Langsdorff, after discussions with his officers, chose to scuttle his ship. With only himself and 40 other men aboard, Graf Spee set sail on December 17th. A crowd of some 20,000 people gathered, expecting her to be sailing to fight the British fleet for better or worse. The Germans would disappoint them, however. After the crew was taken off at the edge of territorial waters, massive explosions blew her apart and set equally massive fires that burned for 2 days. Scuttling charges and ammunition alike had been set off, sinking the raider in shallow water. Graf Spee's career came to a fiery end on that day. Her crew would end up in Argentina, where some of them would remain, and others would try to make their way back to Germany. Captain Langsdorff would not be among them. On December 20th, in full dress uniform, he took his own life while lying on top of his ship's battle ensign in his hotel room. As for the wreck of his ship, it would remain in place. The crew of USS Helena, on her sea trials, would climb aboard in late January 1940. Multiple pictures of her wreck came from this visit, along with a close examination of what was left. Later in the war, during 1942 and 1943, the wreck was partially broken up. Rumors would swirl from this that her steel was used in the construction of pistols in Argentina, though these rumors have mostly been put to bed in the modern day. In any event, with her wreck in shallow water, 11 meters or 36 feet, Graf Spee remained enough of a hazard to navigation that she was further salvaged and scrapped in the early 2000s. Several pieces of the ship were pulled up and preserved, including her optical rangefinder and the eagle off her stern. The former is on display, the latter is a bit of a thorny topic considering the swastika on it. It remains, even now, in a state of limbo as a result. Before I end the video, though, I'll give a quick fun fact about the movie made about her story. The Battle of the River Plate, released in 1956, saw several interesting ships involved. First off, Achilles, then in service with India as INS Delhi, played herself. HMS Cumberland, though disarmed as a trial ship, also played herself at some points. This is a time period where World War II ships could still be found to play themselves in historical films. But, to tie back to what I mentioned when Graf Spee disguised herself, the German raider was played by USS Salem, with absolutely no major effort made to disguise her for the film. The justification used, even up to including her USN number on her bow, was Langsdorff disguising his ship. Funny how fiction follows reality there, isn't it? Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.